Hi, everybody. I am joined once again by Chris Williamson. He's the deputy leader of the Workers' Party, and they are a sovereigntist left-wing party in the UK. And we're going to be talking about the US elections, the UK budget, and if we get time, what's happening in Germany.
Take the first step towards online privacy. Get NordVPN.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much for making yourself available.
Good to be with you.
Yes. Been a while. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself and the Workers' Party and what they stand for?
Yeah, I'm Chris Williamson, former Labour MP, member of the Labour Party for 44 years, MP for 7.5 years. I was a big supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, but to cut a long story short, ended up getting suspended and left the Labour Party and joined the Workers' Party about a couple of years ago now. And I suppose the Workers' Party really is really what the Labour Party used to be. It's a kind of a Tony Benn version of the Labour Party. It's a party that does unashamedly believe in socialism and anti-imperialism, and wants to use the wealth of the nation to create a good society for everybody who lives here. We are an incredibly wealthy country, the sixth biggest economy in the world, and yet we've got 1 in 5 of the population living in poverty, and that's completely unacceptable. And we want to, as I say, bring about a good society, an economy that works for everybody, not just the wealthy elites.
Yes, and it's what you say about the poverty, increasing poverty is just shocking. Because I was working as a child protection social worker for many years, and I've seen the increase in poverty over the years.
Yeah.
I didn't tell you this before we started recording, Chris, but I have been made redundant 2 weeks ago. My local authority, many local authorities, run out of money, and they've cut many of the staff, including myself, in a freeze on recruitment because I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, Chris, but soldiers abroad, paying for them is far more important than paying for social workers at home. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Well, we shouldn't really be having soldiers stationed abroad anyway.
Well, soldiers of foreign nations, the Ukrainian soldiers and the Israeli soldiers.
Absolutely, totally unacceptable. I mean, shouldn't be funding that at all.
No.
That's one of the good things that of Donald Trump's presidency, that at least that conflict might be brought to a speedy conclusion. Let's hope it is. But no, completely wrong priorities, where the government is prepared to throw money at NATO's proxy war whilst keeping our crucially important public services in need of a significant investment. I mean, look, we should have the best public services anywhere in the world, or at least it's on a par with the public services anywhere in the world, given that we are an incredibly wealthy country. And this is all about political priorities in the end. And it's really as a consequence, I think, of 45 years of neoliberal economics, which has held sway ever since Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, although the way was sort of paid for her by Dennis Healey's decision to go to the International Monetary Fund in 1976 and really started implementing a sort of a monetarist policy at the insistence of the IMF. It was ludicrous to go to the IMF anyway. I mean, there's no need for that. And up until that point in time, Labour, when it was a proper political party, a proper left-wing political party, had a commitment in its 1974 manifesto to bring about an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in favour of working people and their families, and they were on track and indeed doing that. But that all got thrown in the bin in 1976, and then, as I say, heralded with the austerity measures that were put in place, brought about significant industrial unrest in the winter of 1978-79, and the aftermath of that led to Thatcher's election victory. And ever since that time, we've had a bipartisan approach to a kind of neoliberal economic agenda. I mean,
look, Chris, I'm going to stop you there. Because I'm going to assert there's something different going on right now, and this is the Sovietization of the United Kingdom. So my local authority, where I was working as a social worker, is not the only one to go bankrupt. Many local authorities are going bankrupt, and then I think what that's going to lead to is greater centralization, and the Labour government already talking about people's assemblies. And these will be people that are appointed that will be running the local authority. These won't be elected councillors that are answerable to their electorate. So we're going to have little polit bureaus being set up. Now, you may not be aware of this yet. I may just be speculating, but this is the direction of travel. And I can also see it with the recent budget. And I want to move on to that because the things for me that were critical about the budget, and I would describe my politics as post-left. It's no longer, it doesn't seem to be about left or right anymore. It seems more about sovereignty and freedom and basic human rights and the ability to live my own life without doing harm to others and not having to register if I had any registered chickens and let the government know about the chickens that I have or may not have, right? So the inheritance tax on farmers is an asset grab, and you add with it the rewilding agenda, and then you add to it the land that's being used for solar panels and wind turbines. And what we're having is a reduction in productive capacity, and then the increase in the cost of fertilizers by the suicidal sanctions against Russia. So then farming becomes more and more expensive. Family farms are going to have to give up their farms. Corporations like BlackRock will buy them up. Then on the other side of that, you have increased national insurance for the biggest employer, which is small business, increased minimum wage for them. So they're being squeezed. We're all being impoverished, and very little in the way of meaningful investment that's going to enrich the population. And the government's going to keep borrowing more, printing more money. Inflation is going to squeeze us.
Well, I disagree with you about the whole concept of about printing money, and we can get into that conversation if you like. But I just want to pick up on your description of it as a Sovietization. In some ways, if we had a Sovietization, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I mean, if you look at what are Soviets? No, they're small councils. This is about giving power to people to have control over their lives at a more local level, and that's where I think we should be moving the country to a situation where do that. And indeed, when I was a leader of the council, I was trying to apply that sort of approach to what the local authority was doing and other public services operating in the city of Derby, where I was the council leader, to devolve budgets and give power back to local people to determine what the priorities should be and where the spend should go. But the other point you made about printing money and borrowing, etc. Well, kind of borrowing is a bit of a misnomer. I mean, much of the so-called borrowing is actually bonds which are purchased by the Bank of England itself. I mean, effectively one arm of the government borrowing from another arm of the government. It's not really borrowing at all. And even the bonds which are purchased by other entities are there's no issue if people wanted to kind of cash those back in again. Well, the government, it's just kind of a few keystrokes in the treasury, to do that. I mean, that's the point. Because we have our own sovereign currency, we have enormous flexibility to invest in the economy to create a good society. And the availability of money is not the issue. This is what I've been banging on about for ages, and more people I think are now waking up to this reality. The availability of money to the government is not an issue. Where the problem of inflation can come about, though, is if that spending exceeds the availability of real resources in the economy. That's what the Chancellor should be focusing on, is identifying real resources to actually create the good society, to invest in provide decent public services, to repair our crumbling infrastructure and so on. And when we talk about real resources, what do we mean? Well, human capital, workers. Do we have the workers to do the work that's required? Have they got the necessary skill set? We therefore, if they haven't, need to invest in that. Where are we going to get the raw materials from? The commodities and all the rest of it. Are they available to the government in pound sterling? So that's the issue, it seems to me. And we get carried away with this notion that we've got to tax and we've got to borrow in order to provide public services. That isn't really how it works. Yes, we do need to tax for a range of different reasons. One of which, of course, is to address the challenge of inflation. If too much money goes into the economy, you can create then shortages of particular commodities, whether it be workers or particular raw materials. If you've got the private sector and the public sector competing for that, you can use the tax system to actually create the space for public sector priorities, and to make sure that the economy reaches a kind of equilibrium where you're not sort of creating a situation where prices get out of hand. Of course, tax is also important to generate a value for the currency. I mean, look, pound sterling hasn't been backed by gold or anything for many decades now. I mean, it used to be linked to the dollar under the Bretton Woods Agreement, which Richard Nixon jettisoned in 1971 because of the pressure of funding the war in Vietnam and so on. And so we've been a floating fiat currency ever since. So the point is, money is no object for the government. That isn't the question. The question is the real resources. What are we doing to find the real resources to build the good society, which I think everybody wants to see. So, when they say they can't afford, for example, to bring the water industry back into public energy, it's complete nonsense. Of course they can do it if they want to. And the other thing which I think is unhelpful when we talk about this kind of notion of tax and spend and, it's important, we've got a tax, etc. We need billionaires and the millionaires in order to create a good society. No, we don't. I mean, I'd be quite happy if they all left the country, the millionaires. They're not necessary. They're surplus to requirements. And I've said this on many occasions when Alan Sugar was threatening to leave the country if Jeremy Corbyn became the leader. My response was publicly to say, great, if he wants, I'll drive him to the airport, because we don't need bumptious billionaires in Britain to create a good society. So, I think one of my missions, if you like, is trying to wake the people up, wake the population up to the fact that we've had the wool pulled over our eyes for generations now about how the monetary system operates. And if we can actually, by giving people the reality, the information about how the monetary system operates, then people won't tolerate this situation. Tony Benn used to say that people knew about the way the system worked. They wouldn't tolerate the poor quality public services, levels of unemployment, and so on. And Henry Ford himself said many moons ago, if people understood how the banking and the monetary system worked, there'd be a revolution by tomorrow morning. And I've been spending the last number of years trying to create that revolution, I suppose.
So just to make clear, when I said about the Sovietization and the Politburos, it's because these people's assemblies, they won't be accountable to the local people in the way the councillors are. That's my issue. I think you and I both agree, we both want greater decentralization and greater democratization and greater transparency whenever and wherever, and people having more say over their lives. Now, one thing I do want to mention, Chris, is the probity, and then we'll go back to the budget, but I just want to let people know that the probitycode.com website, bit.ly/makewarhistory, and this is something that I'm participating in, that according to the International Criminal Court Act 2000 and 2001 and the Terrorism Act 2000, it's illegal to give money to any agency that facilitates, funds, aids and abets terrorism, genocide, war crimes or crimes against humanity. And by its own definitions, in those statutes, what our government is doing in Ukraine, in Yemen, in Israel, is violation of those statutes. And the Supreme Court has ruled, and those statutes make it clear, that government agencies, including the military activities and the quasi-military activities of the United Kingdom, are not exempt. So if HMRC asks me, and I'm actually in negotiation with HMRC, I have a capital gains tax bill, I put it in a revocable trust, I said you can have it, provided you can prove that none of this money is going to be used in violation of these statutes. For 12 months now, we've had back and forth correspondence, and not once have they given me an exemption or an exception saying, listen, HMRC are exempt from these statutes. And we're now at the stage where I've given them an affidavit, a sworn affidavit, which they haven't rebutted, which means that it now stands as fact, because according to those statutes, HMRC asking me for money, which they know is going to be used in violation of those statutes, is illegal. Me paying that money, giving them that money, is also illegal. And it's the same deal with any payment that goes towards central or local government, whatever it is, because it all ends up in a large fund and then gets dispersed. So me and a growing number of people are part of a peaceful, legal, lawful tax revolt against war.
As you know, the point is, taxes do not fund our public services, but there is, in terms of it being in breach of the law, because the government's in breach of the Genocide Convention, it's also failing to implement the responsibility to protect doctrine, which it's signed up to. International law doesn't really apply as far as the West is concerned when it relates to them. It applies
except, Chris, what I'm talking about are domestic statutes.
Yeah, no, I do. I'll tell you.
Yeah, and I'm an honest, law-abiding citizen. I don't want monies being used, right, to go and murder people abroad, right, or anywhere. And it's a form of protest. The government doesn't need our tax money. I agree with you on that, but it's a form of protest.
Yes, I do. That's pretty sensible. No, I take the point, and it's a good campaign to as it were make that point. But it's another indication that the political class are completely out of touch with the wider general public, not just here in Britain, but really right across the Western world. You only have to look at the support there is for the Palestinian people, and the opposition now to Israel, and yet the government continues to provide political and diplomatic cover, continues to supply weapons to Israel, and also intelligence and speculation that even boots on the ground, with special forces and so on. These people are completely amoral characters who really ought to face justice at some point.
Yes, well, imperialists are going to do what imperialists do, and then it's up to ordinary people like you and I to resist and say no. And then one of the things about the tax protest is it gives people, well, I get to keep my money to deal with this bloody cost of living crisis. Yeah, because their government aren't taking care of us. We got to take care of ourselves. Now, the budget. What are your comments on Keir Starmer's budget?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's another missed opportunity. I'm not surprised really by the direction of travel that they took, but there's a massive need in our country to address the crumbling infrastructure, the state of our public services, the fact that we've already mentioned we have 1 in 5 of the population living in poverty, and what Rachel Reeves has done is to make matters even worse for the poorest people in society. For example, she has failed to uprate social security benefits for working age people in line with inflation, and the social security system in this country is already the most parsimonious in Western Europe. I mean, that comes on top of the decision to retain the cap on child benefit. So it's a question of conscious cruelty being implemented by a government that's going to exacerbate child poverty in Britain. In the 6th biggest economy in the world, this is totally unacceptable, totally unjustifiable. And, you know, they're patting themselves on the back, the Labour government, for increasing the minimum wage. And yet, a Joseph Rowntree Foundation report has shown that in order for a single person to have a minimum acceptable standard of living, they would need to earn £28,000 a year. Well, the minimum wage will, after it's been uprated in April, bearing in mind it's not going to be uprated until April, will take a single person, say working a 40-hour week, to around £25,000 a year. So they're going to be £3,000 below what is required for a minimum acceptable standard of living. And for a couple with 2 children, they're going to be £18,000 below. Coupled with the fact that the government's not doing enough to even implement the minimum wage to ensure that it's enforced. And there was a report that was published by the House of Commons Library only last week that showed that 365,000 workers in Britain are being paid below the minimum wage. So we have a poverty epidemic in Britain. And I think back to when I was growing up. I mean, I was born in 1956, obviously, therefore, grew up in the 1960s and 70s, left school in 1972 at 15 years of age with no qualifications, but was able to find a job very, very easily, was able to buy a house, a brand new house, 3 bedrooms, semi-detached, backing onto waterfront, 19 years of age as an apprentice bricklayer. All of my contemporaries at school were able to find work, were able to branch out on their own. Many of them bought, like I did. Others were able to get a council house. All of that's gone. And I think back to the days of when I started out as a social worker and then became a welfare rights officer, but under the old supplementary benefit system, which wasn't adequate even then, actually. But I mean, things got considerably worse. I remember, I think it was the 1986 Social Security Act, if that was the name of it, from memory. I can't just recall whether that was the correct title of it. But anyway, legislation that was brought in by the government, implemented fully in 1988. But prior to that, people who were basically living on subsistence income, supplementary benefit, if there was an emergency, if there, for example, was a matrimonial breakdown or domestic violence, somebody had to, leave the home and set up home again on their own, or kids coming out of care, there was a system called a single payment system where you would get a payment to buy a cooker, a bed, bedding, carpets. You could basically furnish the house. And this was your right under the supplementary benefit system. There's all sorts of additional requirements, depending on your health and type of house you had and things like that. You get some additional top-up payments and so on. Of course, all that got thrown in the bin in 1988 when they introduced income support and they brought in the social fund. And things have got, I thought they couldn't get any worse than that. Things have gone considerably worse since that time. And it's been on a downward trajectory ever since, including the 13 years that we had a Labour government under Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown. And, Gordon Brown often crows about the fact that they reduced the number of children living in poverty, and that's true. But the fact is that income inequality continued to rise. Poverty, indeed, continued to rise. So, they may have lifted, kids out of poverty, but they didn't do enough, it seems to me, to eliminate poverty. And one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn was saying when he was leader of the Labour Party and I was a member of Parliament myself was that he wanted in the lifetime of the Parliament to eradicate street homelessness, which was a laudable aim, but I was saying we should be going considerably further than that. And in the lifetime of the Parliament, we should say that we will eradicate poverty. There will be no poverty in Britain. And, that's an achievable goal. And if you put your mind to it, you uprate social security benefits, you bring about the universal, the universal principle has been trashed, basically, benefits are going to everybody. the argument against that, by those, the neoliberals saying, well, you get like child benefit and winter fuel allowance going to the likes of Alan Sugar and so on. And my response to that is, the way you deal with that is through the tax system. That's another purpose for tax, to address inequality. So, you invest in proper, good quality social security system that is a genuine safety net for people. You invest in our public services. Big increase in public, so big fiscal stimulus to increase the number of public sector workers, a big investment in our economy to tackle our, as I've mentioned, crumbling infrastructure, a big investment in terms of addressing, the adverse weather that we've been getting. It's only so high you can build the walls, it seems to me, to deal with the more frequent flooding, severe flooding that we've been getting. I mean, one of the things I've been suggesting could be done is to reforest the uplands, and that would obviously be a big labour-intensive proposition, and have huge environmental benefits as well. And with the extra rainfall that they're getting of late, this would hold the water for longer, let it leach into the watercourses more gradually, and therefore reduce the flooding risk further downstream. So there's lots of things that could be done. Lots of flexibilities available to a currency issuing government. And the one good thing, maybe he did some other good things, but the standout thing for me that Gordon Brown did is to keep Britain out of the Eurozone. That would have been an absolute disaster, because then you wouldn't be in control of your own currency, and it would be basically relegating the United Kingdom, or it would have relegated the United Kingdom. I know we're out of the European Union now anyway, so it's all pretty academic, but had we done that, it would have relegated the United Kingdom to the status of a local authority. I mean, the local authorities, are not, they're not in control of their finances. Their finances are finite by how much they can raise through council tax, under charges, and grants they receive from the government, etc. And that would have been an absolute disaster had they done that. But he didn't do that, and that was good. But what we're not doing is taking advantage of the opportunities, the flexibilities that are available to a currency issuing government to do the sorts of things that I've set out there. I mean, there really is no justification for the sort of situation where we're seeing people really struggling to, heat their homes, put food on the table. I mean, goodness gracious me, we're living in the 21st century. I mean, we're kind of going back to Victorian era.
Yeah, and just on that last point, it's insane, Chris, because a few years ago we were being encouraged to have a novel medical intervention in order to save Granny, stay away from her. But now, forget all that. Granny's going to freeze to death.
Absolutely. The Labour Party's own impact assessment, I think this was undertaken when there was a rumour that the Tories were going to scrap the winter fuel allowance. That concluded that the abolition of the winter fuel allowance will lead to nearly 4,000 pensioners losing their lives through not being able to heat their homes properly and cold-related illnesses, etc. I mean, and when I was working in social services, I did a lot of work with older people, and you clearly the older you get, you're more susceptible to cold-related illnesses and so on. And I mean, as I say, in a country that is the sixth biggest economy in the world, for people to be effectively freezing to death or dying from conditions brought about through living in a cold house, goodness me, I mean. What kind of mindset drives these politicians to take these sorts of decisions? It's absolutely appalling. They've done it in the full knowledge that, as I've said, quite dramatic. They're effectively passed a death sentence on 4,000 pensioners this winter.
Yep. Well, I have a particular point of view about those that are behind the scenes pulling strings. That it is a depopulation agenda, part and parcel of that, driving us towards CBDCs, biometric IDs, and digital IDs. And one of the things that got launched on the day of the budget is a department for digital IDs. We never voted for that. That wasn't on the Labour Party manifesto. Plus also the proposal for assisted dying. What? No. How about taking care of people? Because that could cause all sorts of problems within a family where, for example, the children are falling out with their parents or whatever and are pressuring their parents, look, go and get yourself snuffed. And then my concern is that governments always overextend their powers over time, especially when there's a slow rolling, as is happening now, monetary collapse in the background, because that's going on. And that doesn't necessarily make the press, but and without any democratic control. Now, by the way, Chris, I didn't vote for this Labour government. I have voted Labour before, but I stopped voting. Labour didn't automatically get my vote after Tony Blair's first election in the war in Iraq. That's it. No. You got to work. You got to work, right? But Keir Starmer, oh my God, please. Now, I said on many of my videos, Rishi Sunak is going to do such an awful job, that he's going to hand Keir Starmer a massive majority. And then what that does is it gets rid of the 100 or so liberty-loving Tory MPs who were opposed to things like vaccine mandates. And along the way, while that was going on, Keir Starmer's expunging the Labour of the liberty-loving left wing, people like Jeremy Corbyn, and silencing and squashing people like Diane Abbott. Now what we've got are blow-ins from the Central Party headquarters who are just doing their bidding as they're told. 20% of the electorate voted for them, a massive unearned majority. What can we do?
Well, I mean, I think we
can wait another 4 or 5 years for an election.
We can't just simply look. Democracy shouldn't be just simply about casting a vote once every 4 or 5 years. I mean, people, I'm hoping, will get active on the ground, on the street, in their communities. The key thing is kind of raising political consciousness, it seems to me, giving people information. And going back to the point that I was making about Henry Ford, if people understood how the monetary system operated, and Tony Benn's passion for, education and so on, that's the key, really, to kind of, raise people's consciousness about the fact that the difficulties that we are experiencing in the country are all political choices, and it doesn't have to be this way. And of course, you're absolutely right about Starmer, but the purge against socialists and anti-imperialist members of the Labour Party started under Jeremy Corbyn's watch. I mean, obviously Jeremy was the main target because they wanted to destroy that whole project. I was targeted, and I was Jeremy's loudest supporter in the Parliamentary Labour Party, but they targeted me and suspended me. I ultimately resigned from the party. But Jeremy should have been stronger and stood up to that. I mean, that was a failing on Jeremy's part, really. And we might not have still got over the line, but the capitulation strategy, the appeasement strategy, was an absolute disaster, and they kept going back to it, even though it was proving to be totally futile. I mean, it would have been, I think, an unworthy strategy in any event. But if you could argue that it was paying dividends, it was actually quietening down the absurd accusations of anti-Semitism and so on, you can maybe say, well, look, politically it's working. But it wasn't working. I mean, every time Jeremy backed down and made an apology or prostrated himself before the Zionist Board of Deputies or the Jewish Leadership Council, these are misnamed organisations, really, because they just are burning a torch for Israel, for the Zionist project. And they certainly don't speak for all Jews. But every time Jeremy did that, I mean, they just went for more. I mean, to be fair, I did say this to Jeremy. I pleaded with him to stop apologising and said that every time he apologises, he's just feeding the beast. I also implored the so-called Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs to step up to the plate and to resist the attacks that were becoming, more and more frequent. But none of them would do it. I mean, they were all too frightened, and they were all putting their careers ahead of doing what's right.
Yeah, so it reminds me, Chris, of an abusive relationship.
Yeah, absolutely, it's like a Stockholm syndrome. But he's got no Starmer has no political legitimacy. Yes, he's got an overwhelming majority that can do what he likes, but in terms of democracy, like you say, I mean, less than 20% of the population, less than 1 in 5 of the population voted for him. And actually, look at those that did vote in the election. He got less than 34%. That is the lowest percentage of the people voting in an election that a winning party's ever achieved. And because of the vagaries of our appalling electoral system, not only has he won, but he's won with a landslide majority. So his position, whilst it might look unassailable at the moment, is actually quite precarious. And we could see a complete reversal of fortunes at the next election. But as we were just saying, it's important that people don't just simply sit back and wait for the next election. We need to organise in the interim and look at kind of building community resilience and community sustainability in that sense, and and looking out for each other and working together. And if we do that, then we can still make some progress and resist the worst excesses, it seems to me, of this particular political party that's in power at the moment.
Yes. Now, I do see that happening, but outside of the party's system.
Yes.
Organising sustainable communities, being in communication with each other. And I think part of that is to do with and you and I've mentioned this before, and I don't want to go into it in depth, is the betrayal of the left when it came to the lockdowns and the impact that had on the poor and the working poor. So that people started congregating, organising themselves. That's going on. And also, I think there's a movement where people are learning more and more about our basic rights, going back to the 1688 Bill of Rights, which is actually a stronger constitutional document than the American Bill of Rights. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all. It's still in force. It created Parliament as representatives of the people. It says Parliament shall not pass any laws that are to the pejorative of the people, and that these rights are for perpetuity and cannot be changed. Parliament cannot change them. And they include the freedom of speech. They include the right to bear arms. They include the ability for each individual person to deny consent for any particular statute.
The problem is, of course, the political class ride roughshod over any kind of laws that don't suit them, or they repeal them or whatever. But and this is why politics still does have a place. I don't think people should abandon it altogether, because what we need is people, getting into Parliament to kind of articulate the sort of points that you are just outlining there. I mean, and as you may know, I stood in the general election and didn't get elected. Unfortunately, none of the Workers' Party candidates did. We didn't do too badly in the overall scheme of things, but you don't get any prizes for coming second. Overall, we fielded, I think, 151 candidates and returned something like 210,000 votes across the country, and getting close in a number of constituencies. I wasn't particularly close, but it was a respectable vote for over 5,000, but we were hoping for and looking for more. Had we had a bit more time to organise, had the election come in the autumn as we thought it was going to do, we would have had over 500 candidates, and I think we may have done somewhat better because we'd have had more time to get our ducks in a row, as it were. But we're going to continue to build up for the subsequent election whenever it comes. It's probably going to be 4 or 5 years. I can't see them going for an early election. Why would they? And particularly as they're now incredibly unpopular, they'll hang on probably for as long as they can. But yeah, I mean, had I been in Parliament, had I managed to get over the line, I mean, there's clearly a number of things that I would have been raising in Parliament on the floor of the House of Commons, but also having those two initials after your name does give you a bigger platform. And it gives you the opportunity then to articulate some of these points, some of the points that you've been making, some of the things I've been saying about the economy and so on, to a wider audience, and on the mainstream media as well, and so on. And that would help, I think, to raise the political consciousness. But nevertheless, in spite of the fact that the Workers' Party was ghosted effectively in the election, there's hardly any mention of the fact that we were fielding the number of candidates that we did, and the fact that we got George Galloway was a member of Parliament, we got more councillors than Reform had at that time, and yet we never got the oxygen of publicity that the Reform Party did. And I think if people had the opportunity to hear what the Workers' Party stood for, what we were about, I think more people would have rallied to our corner. I know that just anecdotally, when I was campaigning in my own constituency, a lot of people still haven't heard of the Workers' Party, obviously. As I was canvassing in some parts of the constituency and chatting to me, and they were saying, "Well, I've never heard of you." And some of the people that were saying they were going to vote for reform out of desperation. But when I explained, what we were about, I mean, they were quite attracted by that. And had we had more volunteers on the ground, then I think we could have taken that message out to a wider audience. I mean, regrettably, because we were taking a bit unawares, it came before the election was called, before we were able to prepare properly. So we just didn't have enough volunteers on the ground. I'm not saying we didn't necessarily won it, but I do think we'd have, in Derby North, Derby South, this is where I stood, we would have got a much bigger vote than we achieved. And we may have got over the line. I think in other constituencies, we would have definitely got over the line. I think George, for example, in Rochdale would have been with a chance. And Jodie McIntyre in Birmingham, I think he came within 500 votes, very, very close. So, it's doable in spite of all of the obstacles that are in the way of insurgent political parties. I think people are fed up, aren't they? I mean, it's pretty clear the fact that the turnout was as low as it was, the fact that Labour has got in with, like you were saying, only 20%, less than 20%, in fact, of the population. The fact that Reform got as many votes as it did, actually, I think that is a kind of a protest vote. Because one of the things that I found in 2017, before the witch hunt got really going, and actually before Jeremy's his reputation had been tarnished, and the fact that he hadn't at that point in time he'd made too many concessions even by then, but not as many as he subsequently did. But a lot of people who voted UKIP in the 2015 election, which is the kind of forerunner, I suppose, of Reform, isn't it? Really, Nigel Farage's vehicle. Most of them voted Labour in the end. It's certainly in Derby North, where I was the MP, and we targeted the UKIP voters explicitly. With a programme that we were putting forward, and people were definitely attracted by that. And, we were using even the sort of terminology about taking back control, but Labour was the only party that was going to take back control of the economy. Going to take back control from these foreign global corporations that own our utilities, train companies, etc. And that was the point that I was making. That we wanted to democratize the economy. We want to take control of our utilities, which have been run by foreign entities, some of which are state-owned foreign entities. I mean, that's the irony of it. The train companies are owned by foreign, companies which are owned by foreign governments, and then charging excessive fares in this country to help to subsidise fares back in their own country. Good luck to them, and actually, they can understand them doing it. But what in God's name are we doing? It's like Labour and the Tories all in favour of state ownership, just not British state ownership. If it's another state, they're quite happy.
Yes.
And I think the more that people realise that, the more likely they are to vote for alternatives, as it were. But one of the things that the left, if I can call it that, needs to do is to get its act together. But the left a large sections of the left have lost their way. I mean, they've become obsessed with identity politics, and this has really, I think, been a big turn off. Lots and lots
Absolutely.
of.
And Chris, just on that, right? The identity politics, it's a deliberate manipulative ploy. And one way to tell is it excludes a class dimension.
Of course, absolutely. And it poses no threat to the establishment. And that's why you get the obscene spectacle. I may have mentioned this to you before at Pride marches, where you've got arms manufacturers, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, BAE Systems, proudly marching in the Pride marches. It's just absolutely obscene. Because it poses no threat. I mean, you had Boris Johnson, didn't you, saying, I have the most diverse cabinet in history. Well, yes, he may have had more black and brown faces around the table, more women around the table, but it wasn't a diverse cabinet at all. They represented the interests of the 1%.
Yeah,
not the interests of the working class. The vast majority of people in the country. But yeah, I mean that's. And I think this is what I mean. The whole thing about trans rights and all the rest of it. The obsession with that. That's actually alienated a lot of people. A lot of traditional Labour voters actually.
I think it's been done deliberately to divide and rule.
Yes, of course. The British Empire survived on divide and rule. It was the most successful empire in the world, wasn't it? And it achieved that through divide and rule. And they're applying the same principles today, aren't they?
That's right. Imperialists always end up eating their own. I don't know if you're familiar with what's going on in Ireland. The horrendous destruction of Ireland by the Irish ruling class. It's, the sexualization of children, the trans agenda, Ireland's population going up from 3.9 million to 5.1 million in the absence of economic growth. And the people being brought in are people from Africa, Asia. Now, I'm an immigrant myself. I have no issue with vetted immigrants, but these are single men that the government is spending money on bringing in and depositing all over Ireland in the absence of economic growth.
Well, we need to be careful in terms of how we sort of approach this. I mean, because immigration has been a strength for Britain, for example. But I think what we need to do is go backwards. Why are people seeking asylum or refuge in this country or Ireland, for that matter? And in large measure, it's down to imperialist wars and imperialist exploitation. And that's where the Workers' Party takes a view that. We have there is concern. We understand some of the anxieties about mass immigration and so on. But what we say is we need to stop the reason why people are seeking refuge in the first place, and that's why we call for the withdrawal from NATO and end to the wars, etc., and stop the ruthless exploitation. Let's have an equal kind of partnership, and in a way, I suppose, let's embrace the sort of foreign policy that the Chinese do. I mean, they go into developing countries and so on, and they don't do it just out of the goodness of their own heart when they go and build infrastructure, bridges, and and poverty relief measures. They want something back, of course, commodities or whatever, but it's done in a more of a kind of a partnership approach, and of course,
scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I'll build you roads, and you give me access to your resources. It's a trade.
It's what we should. We should be kind of following the Chinese example there, it seems to me. But we've still got this gunboat diplomacy mentality, from the old kind of, British Empire days. And, nothing has really sort of changed. And that's what does need to change. But, one of the things I always say to people when they do, on the doorstep, complain about migration, I always say, look, mate, you've got more in common with the people that the migrants that you're complaining about than you've got with the people at the top of society. And there is the unifying factor here is the fact that the people who are responsible for migrants seeking refuge over here are the same people that, because of the ruthless exploitation I mentioned and the investment in the arms industry and so on, the promotion of wars, are the same people that screwing us in this country.
Sure.
And what we need to be doing is linking arms and actually raising our eyes above the horizon and focusing, on who the real enemy is. And it's not the migrants; it's the global.
No, they're as much victims as anybody, as the working class here, right? But my point is, this wave of migration is different to what happened in 50s and 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
These weren't asylum seekers. This is what I'm part of the cloud pivot strategy, because it destroys a culture. I would not want. I'm Pakistani. I would not. Pakistan's population is about 250 million. I would not want Pakistan's population to increase by 50 million in the matter of a few years in the absence of economic growth. There's no jobs for these people, with people from all over Africa, South America, Europe, China, wherever. Most of them are going to end up in cities like Karachi and Lahore, where the infrastructure isn't able to cope. It's more of the divide and rule. The bloody imperialists pitting people against each other. And then,
absolutely. I know what people also say.
Hold on a second, please. What's happening in Ireland is the destruction of a homogenous culture. Ireland wasn't an imperialist nation. They're being colonized again because it's the colonialists, the supranational, non-governmental organizations that are bringing these people in. George Soros' Open Society, the United Nations.
No, I get that. Although, some of that anxiety that you're articulating now that is being expressed, those same anxieties were being articulated, back in the 50s and 60s by.
But there were jobs.
In fact, when Idi Amin expelled the Asian community out of Uganda, many settled, as you know, in Leicester. But Leicester City Council, I think they took advertisements saying, "Don't come to Leicester, we don't want you." And I think the other thing as well, people say, all these single men that's coming over. Well, the sort of wave of migration that you're talking about, it very often was the head of the family, if you like, the man generally, would come first, get settled here, as it were, and then bring the family over. So
yeah, they came for jobs. There are
yes, no, I take that point. Yes, indeed, there were jobs for them to do. That is absolutely correct, and this is where we've seen the destruction of our manufacturing base in this country. I know, just again to talk anecdotally, when I left school in 1972, and I was mentioning earlier how it was possible for working class youngsters like me to easily find work and to buy and aspire to and buy our own homes, as it were. But there were, I didn't actually go into I did work for a while in a factory. I ended up in the building trade, actually, believe it or not. But in Derby alone, there was about 120,000 manufacturing jobs, Rolls-Royce alone employed 35,000 people. Salinese had 20,000 people. The railway had around about 20,000 people. You've got Qualcast, Leeds Foundry, and many, many, many supply chain, small SMEs, that were employing, tens and 20s and sometimes a few hundred people, but 120,000 jobs. It was easy to get in and out of employment. It's like a desert now in terms of manufacturing. Yes, there is manufacturing still in Derby. I don't want to kind of overstate it. And Rolls-Royce is still a big player in Derby, but it's gone from 35,000 in the 1970s employees to I think it's around about 11,000 today. But like Celanese, Courtaulds as it became. That's been literally razed to the ground. There's nothing happening there now. That's gone completely. Where are those jobs gone? Well, they've gone overseas. Similarly with the Qualcast, with the Leeds Foundry, all these jobs have gone. The railway employs a fraction of the people that it used to do, and it's owned by a foreign company now. British Rail used to be British Rail. It was the carriage and wagon and the loco works, and then pre-privatisation it became British Rail Engineering Limited, and then it was kind of flogged off to the private sector. But these were good, well-paid, skilled and semi-skilled jobs. They gave people security. Those jobs don't exist, and a lot of the people that you mentioned, the wave of migration from the Indian subcontinent in Derby. Again, I'm talking anecdotally here, but this is kind of reflected, I think, across the country. Many of those first-generation migrants, they worked in there. They were bloody hard work. It was tough work, in the foundries and so on and so forth. But there were those jobs. You're absolutely right. There were plenty of those sorts of jobs around there. That's true, and that's what we need to be getting back to. We need to be investing in our economy. We could maybe not recapture the old kind of manufacturing days, but the fourth industrial revolution, we need to be looking to invest in that to capture, the kind of new wave of technological innovation, but also just investing in our public services. And that will generate lots of jobs. I mean, there's a massive care crisis in this country at the moment. I mean, we should be paying our care staff a lot more than we are doing. But, that should be addressed. We've got, as we mentioned, about the infrastructure in a terrible state of disrepair. There's so much that needs doing to actually, when I walk around, I go to London once a week because I present a program about Palestine, Palestine Declassified, if people want to look it up. Every week, for the last 4 months, it's kind of really getting to me now. When I get to St Pancras Station, one of the escalators has been inoperable now. It's been completely blanked off now for well over 4 or 5 months. I think, what in God's name were they doing? And then I look around and, St Pancras is a beautiful building, but and it was a nice job that was made of it. But I look around and you can see it's fading at the edges, it's dirty and so on. And we could be employing a whole army of people, keeping this in tip-top shape, tip-top condition, as it were. Pay people properly, good jobs. If this was China, mate, that escalator would have been mended in an half an hour or something. It's just ridiculous.
And I'm going to say it's all deliberate, and I want to move on to the US, right? And there was something you said earlier about trade and everything. It sounded to me like some of the Workers' Party's policies or that approach is similar to what the Trump administration is going to do, because J.D. Vance was talking about trading with other countries, having relationships of respect with other countries, and so just something about what's your personal stand or the Workers' Party stand on what's happening with the US and the new administration. I said to you before we started recording, I'm grateful that Kamala Harris is not president. I'm grateful for that.
She ran a right-wing campaign, a right-wing neoliberal pro-war campaign, and it's not surprising then that many people didn't vote for her. And Trump. I don't burn a torch for Trump in any way, shape, or form. But there's not much to choose. I think, and if anything, people talk about the lesser of two evils. I don't think Kamala Harris was a lesser of the two evils. Trump, I think there's a good chance he will stop the war in Ukraine. That's great. This idea about, he didn't necessarily fulfill it when he was in previously, but, because a lot of the Rust Belt swing states, they got behind him. And that's kind of replicated in this country. You don't call it the Rust Belt here, but there's all manufacturing and heavy industry towns and cities up and down the country, which have just been abandoned. And he's basically offering hope and saying, look, we're going to revitalise these economies once again. We're going to create the kind of jobs for people, and that is certainly something. Let's wait and see, whether he kind of fulfils and delivers on that. Let's hope he does. Of course, his position on Israel is as bad, if not worse, and that's a very troubling and worrying position, and his some of the rhetoric that we've heard him say in relation to Iran and so is also very, very worrying as well. And let's not forget, he signed off on the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which was an absolutely outrageous war crime. I should never, he should really, been hauled before the international court for that. But of course, it's never going to happen. So, he's certainly not perfect, far from it. But people that are, getting their knickers in a twist about the fact that Harris hasn't got in. They're just, really. Honestly, let's remember they've been financing a genocide in Gaza, and they are continuing.
Ukraine.
Well, I was about to mention Ukraine, of course, absolutely. And, that war should never have started, actually. Russia put forward a peace and security proposition in 2021, which talked about no further NATO expansion, Ukraine becoming a neutral country, etc. Perfectly reasonable proposition. It was just laughed out of court, totally kind of ripped up and given no house room whatsoever. And then shortly after Russia's military operation started, as you'll recall, a month or so into that, they were on the verge of signing a peace agreement. And then Boris Johnson was dispatched over there, if you recall, and said, "Look, don't go carry on with this peace, because we will continue to support you." I think it was. I was listening to a quote about a friend of. It's dangerous to be an enemy of the United States. Henry Kissinger, this is. Dangerous for to be an enemy of the United States, but to be a friend is fatal. And I think that's very apposite in relation to when you think about what's happening in Ukraine and what's the likely outcome in the end, and there would be so many other examples around about Saddam Hussein was an ally, wasn't he, of the United States? So there are so many examples like this around the world. Let's hope that anyway that will be brought to a conclusion, because there are literally press ganging people into the military from the street, aren't they, in Ukraine, and throwing people, getting right up to the age of 60 years, I believe, people are being thrown into Zelensky's meat grinder. It's absolutely despicable, man, and we need to bring that to a conclusion as soon as we possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. And then with regards to Israel, I was looking at some of the main picks in his transition team. One is he doesn't have any corporate lobbyists in his transition team. He himself is anti-war, pro-Zionist. J.D. Vance, anti-war, pro-Zionist. Tulsi Gabbard, anti-war, and I think pro-Zionist. Thomas Massie, anti-war, not a Zionist. He beat off AIPAC, who tried to get him to lose his Senate seat. Rand Paul, anti-war. I'm not sure about his position about Zionism. Ron Paul, anti-war, not a Zionist. So there is some hope, and Trump did refuse to bomb Iran when John Bolton was pressing him to do so. And the Middle East was much, much calmer. And one of the things a regular guest of mine, Alex Craner, said about when Trump said that we're going to stay in Syria to steal the oil and the grain. He tried to get the US troops to leave. The Pentagon defied him. He then said, okay, we're going to stay. We're going to steal the oil. And everybody at the time criticized him for being so dumb and undiplomatic and how gauche is he. But the effect of that was the Europeans had no cover for moving in. They didn't say, we're doing it for democracy. No, we're doing it for piracy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
so who knows if that was deliberate or not, but it isolated the US. And I agree with you and Soleimani, and he should have should have pardoned Snowden. He should release Ross Fulbright. You may not know who he is, but he's big in the Bitcoin world.
And Julian, of course, and there was some hope that he might have pardoned Julian, before he left.
Absolutely. Far from ideal, but not a warmonger in the mold.
Well, absolutely. It didn't start a war, did it? It didn't start a war. And that has got to be applauded.
Yeah, which takes something. So, fingers crossed. Yeah. And I think it's going to have an impact on the neo-colonialists in the European Union and in the UK. And we just have, in the remaining time we have left, the German government is collapsing. And part of it, I think, is because of this suicidal sanctions against Russia versus lobbying for peace, and the deindustrialization of Germany.
Yes, indeed.
And please, Chris, please, can we please have the EU just disappear into the bowels of history?
Absolutely. Look, the EU's always been a capitalist club, and it's completely enthralled to the United States of America. Completely counterproductive sanctions against Russia. Cutting off the Nord Stream oil to gas, to cheap gas. It's just absolutely. Germany's economy, was the workshop of Europe, wasn't it? It was a colossus, and it's being destroyed by these crazy decisions at the behest of the United States of America. And now I understand it. They're buying gas from the United States at about 4 times the price that they were receiving it from Russia, and all the efforts that they've tried to put into the sanctions against Russia to try and screw its economy and so on and so forth and isolate it. Well, Russians. Last time I looked, the ruble was one of the strongest currencies in the world. And they found an alternative to the SWIFT system that they kicked them out of and so on. And I think the counterproductive measures that they've taken against Russia, where they've seized their assets and so on. That's going to, other countries around the world who are not in the kind of a G7 will be thinking, well, why would we want to be associated, with a club that does that? Our resources are not safe. You never know what might happen in the future, as it were. So, absolutely ridiculous, counterproductive measures that were taken. As I say again, at the behest of the hawks in the US. And let's hope that there's a realization. With Trump's election, not only might the war in Ukraine be brought to a swift conclusion, let's hope so. The future of NATO, of course, is also in question now. And that would also be a thoroughly good thing as well. Why is NATO even still in existence? It was only set up to allegedly deal with a so-called threat which would never existed from the Soviet Union, and it was established, I think, 5 or 6 years before the Warsaw Pact was. But the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and here we have not only has NATO continued, it's nearly doubled in size. And the pledge that was given that it wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward if James Baker gave, that commitment that James Baker gave to Mikhail Gorbachev if he agreed to the reunification of Germany. And of course, that's completely broken. Clinton started it, and as I say, nearly doubled in size. And the latest, what's happened with Ukraine and so on is the proposition of Ukraine joining NATO was one of the driving factors that caused the situation that we find ourselves in today. But the United States and the EU were complicit in the violent overthrow of the democratically elected government. Whatever you think of that democratically elected government, it was the democratically elected administration that they helped to overthrow. And the people that were in the vanguard of that movement were literal Nazis in the right sector, the Azov Battalion, and so on. So it's an interesting time, certainly, and Trump's election will be will certainly I think create some interesting developments over the next year or so, and let's hope that they're for the better, not for the worse.
Yeah, well, I don't buy into how the mainstream media smear and other him. The same outlets like The Guardian, the BBC that called Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite. I knew they were lying. And then they go and say Trump's Hitler. They lied about Corbyn. And how I should believe them what they're saying about Trump, and that the Trump and Corbyn, and also I'd bring in Orban, are challenges, are threat, and Marine Le Pen to some degree as well, are threats to the neoliberal globalist order. That's what they're challenging. So fingers crossed. I think more and more people are waking up. More and more people are getting engaged in politics, and politics being having a say over our lived experience of lives, of where our food comes from, what happens with the money that we pay taxes in, how our local communities are run. So I'll have the links to Workers' Party in the description below. I also want to mention on the 19th of November in London, and I'm looking to see if I can go as well. There's a demonstration in favor of the farmers. There's because we don't want family farms being taken over by BlackRock, for crying out. Exactly. And there's also the regular demonstrations in support of peace in Palestine. So I'll have, and I think you're absolutely rightfully very involved in that. Good for you. So I'll have those links in the description below. Is there anything you want to say, Chris, before we finish up?
Just keep hope alive, really. Don't give up. It's bleak at the moment, but if you think back to the Labour movement pioneers, I mean, the situation then was much bleaker than the situation that we're facing today. And in the end, we prevailed. They secured the universal franchise. We built the welfare state. And we started bringing about a good society. I know things have been going in reverse for some time now, but what is crucial is that when people work together, anything is possible. Solidarity is key. And that's why the establishment worked so hard to destroy social solidarity, that social cohesion, that bringing people together, something which was really prevalent, I think, in the post-war Britain, and certainly lasted, through to my early life. There was a real sense of community, and I think that has never really gone away properly, and we're beginning to see that re-emerging. And an example of that, I suppose, is we do care about each other. I mean, an example of that is when you see an ambulance coming. People, they get out of their way. Because they want to help to make sure that the ambulance can get there to assist somebody who's obviously in a dire predicament, as it were. Although, having said that, I mean, the ambulance service is in a terrible state at the moment, and the response times are, I mean, because of the cutbacks that we've seen and the way in which the health service is being organised now. When I was a lad, and they're not even then, relatively recently, if you called 999, you'd expect an ambulance to turn up in literally minutes. Sometimes people can be waiting hours. I mean, literally hours and hours and hours. I know I speak to one person, they were waiting for 12 hours. This was somebody who was in an excruciating agony. You think she's an elderly woman, broken her hip, and had to wait for 12 hours. And a friend of mine was involved in a tragic fatal accident with some youngsters joyriding. But anyway, one of the kids got killed. He was badly shaken up. I mean, he was hurt, but no broken bones. But he said it was an hour and a half before the ambulance arrived, and somebody had been killed. And when he got taken to hospital, he was waiting outside for 2 hours in the ambulance before he could be seen. This is the state of the situation that we're facing.
It's deliberate. It's absolutely deliberate. The government, Keir Starmer, they have a choice. He has a choice. I can either allocate some money for this activity, or I can give $3 billion to Zelensky every year.
Yeah. Well,
we can do, like you said, is connect with worse the effects, or get connected to others, care about each other, get involved, get active, check out the Workers' Party, check out the farmers' demonstrations, get involved in the demonstrations for peace or the movements for peace, get involved in the tax revolt, bit.ly/makewarhistory, and do what we can to take care of ourselves and each other's, because the government ain't doing that.
No, precisely. Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Look forward to having you on again. Everybody, share this video, pass it around. Comments, questions in the description below. And between now and when I see you next, keep filling your pockets with freedom and justice. It's Chris and Rich signing out. All the best. Bye-bye.
Yeah, good luck. Cheers. Bye.